Welcome to Lore of the Lost, where we uncover stories from the past steeped in truth and historical accuracy. Get unheard of perspectives and discover what life was really like during these times. Listen to the boring history and the soft crackle of a nearby campfire as you drift off into another world. I am George Lancaster, your speaker tonight, and please let me hear where you're listening from and what time it is for you in the comments. Now listen along as we adventure into the gritty reality of federal law enforcement in 1978 Kansas City, where one man's courage would help dismantle an empire built on violence and silence. The alarm clock's metallic ring cut through the humid August morning at precisely 5:30 a.m., just as it had every day for the past 8 months. Special Agent Michael Torino rolled over in the narrow bed of his cramped apartment on Troost Avenue, feeling the familiar weight of another day's deception settling over him like a heavy coat. The thin walls of the building carried the sounds of his neighbors, shift workers heading to the stockyards, children crying, the distant hum of morning traffic already building toward another scorching Kansas City summer day. Mike had chosen this apartment deliberately. Located in the heart of what locals called the Italian district, though most of the Italian families had long since moved to nicer neighborhoods, it placed him within walking distance of the social clubs, restaurants, and legitimate businesses that formed the visible surface of Nick Civella's criminal empire. The rent was $53 a month, paid in cash to a landlord who asked no questions and kept no detailed records. Exactly the kind of arrangement that would appeal to a small-time criminal trying to keep a low profile. The morning routine never varied. Mike would shower in water that ran lukewarm at best, dress in clothes carefully selected from discount stores around the city. Never too nice, never too shabby. His cover story required him to be Tony Mercurio, a freelance burglar and fence from Detroit who had come to Kansas City looking for new opportunities. The backstory had been meticulously crafted by FBI analysts, complete with planted arrest records in Detroit, references from carefully coached informants, and even staged encounters with legitimate criminals who could vouch for Tony's credentials if anyone bothered to check. The psychological preparation was perhaps more challenging than the physical. Each morning, Mike would spend 15 minutes standing before the cracked bathroom mirror, transforming from a federal agent sworn to uphold the law into a career criminal comfortable with violence and theft. The change wasn't just about adopting mannerisms and speech patterns. Though he had spent countless hours practicing the specific dialect of working-class Detroit, mixed with Italian-American expressions that would be familiar to his targets. It was about inhabiting a completely different moral universe, one where loyalty meant silence and business disputes were settled with baseball bats and bullets. By 6:15 a.m., Mike would be walking the 8 blocks to Caruso's Diner on Independence Avenue, a breakfast spot favored by late-shift factory workers and early-rising criminals alike. The diner served as an informal meeting place for lower-level associates of the Civella organization, men who moved stolen goods, collected debts, and handled the 1,000 small tasks that kept organized crime profitable. The FBI had identified Caruso's through months of surveillance, noting the regular presence of known associates and the way certain conversations would cease abruptly when unfamiliar faces appeared. The waitress, a heavy-set woman named Dorothy with bleached blonde hair and arms mapped with old burn scars from kitchen accidents, had grown accustomed to the quiet stranger who always ordered black coffee and 2 eggs over easy. She never asked questions, which Mike appreciated. In his cover identity, being memorable was dangerous. Tony Mercurio needed to be the kind of man people could describe but wouldn't particularly remember. Average height, brown hair going grey at the temples, the kind of face that could disappear in a crowd. The real work began when other regular customers started arriving. There was Jimmy Torino, no relation despite the similar surname, a numbers runner who handled bets for the organization's illegal gambling operation. At 62 years old, Jimmy had been running numbers since the days of Tom Pendergast's political machine, when Kansas City was genuinely an open city where gambling and prostitution operated with official sanction. His weathered hands showed the calluses of someone who had worked construction before finding more lucrative employment in the shadow economy. Sitting at the counter with his coffee and morning newspaper, Mike would listen to the casual conversations that revealed the intricate structure of organized crime. Jimmy might complain about having to collect from deadbeat gamblers, mentioning specific names and addresses. Another regular, a truck driver named Sal Benedetto, would grumble about having to make unscheduled stops at certain warehouses, unknowingly describing the logistics of moving stolen merchandise. These conversations, seemingly mundane, provided the FBI with crucial intelligence about the organization's operations. The challenge for Mike was responding appropriately without revealing his true identity. When Jimmy mentioned trouble with a particularly stubborn debtor, Mike might nod knowingly and comment that some people never learned until they got their legs broken. When Sal complained about dealing with pain-in-the-ass warehouse supervisors, Mike could agree that sometimes you had to make people understand their place in the pecking order. These responses established his criminal bona fides while avoiding any suggestion that he might be looking to horn in on their territory. After breakfast, Mike would typically spend the morning hours walking the neighborhood, familiarizing himself with the geography of organized crime. There was the Villa Capri Pizzeria at 2609 Independence Avenue, where Nick Savella himself sometimes held court in the back dining room. The FBI had been trying to get surveillance inside the Villa Capri for months, but the restaurant's owner, Tommy Simone, was a trusted associate who carefully screened anyone seeking entry to the inner sanctum. 2 blocks south stood the Marlowe House, a modest ranch-style home that served as an unofficial meeting place for mid-level family members. The FBI had successfully planted listening devices in the house 6 months earlier, and the intelligence gathered there was already proving invaluable. Mike's job was to establish relationships that might eventually earn him an invitation inside, where he could provide visual confirmation of the participants in recorded conversations. The social dynamics of organized crime, Mike had learned, were far more complex than the popular image of ruthless efficiency suggested. Like any large organization, the Kansas City family was riven with personal animosities, competing ambitions, and simple miscommunications. Nick Savella commanded respect through a combination of personal charisma and carefully applied violence, but maintaining control over several hundred associates scattered across Missouri, Kansas, and parts of neighboring states required constant attention to political nuances that would have challenged a legitimate corporate executive. Family members were expected to kick up a percentage of their earnings to their superiors, but the exact percentages were often matters of negotiation and personal relationship. A soldier who had proven his worth might be allowed to keep a larger share of his take, while someone who had fallen from favor might find himself contributing an ever-increasing portion of his illegal profits to the family coffers. These internal economic pressures created opportunities for the FBI to exploit. A dissatisfied associate might be willing to provide information in exchange for the promise of reduced federal charges when the inevitable arrests came. By noon, Mike would often find himself at the Northside Social Club, a storefront operation that served as both a legitimate private club for Italian-American men and an unofficial headquarters for criminal planning. The club maintained the facade of a social organization dedicated to preserving Italian cultural traditions, complete with bocce ball courts in the back and framed photographs of Sicily decorating the walls. Members paid modest monthly dues and could enjoy card games, television broadcasts of sports events, and meals prepared by volunteers from the neighborhood. The reality was more complex. While some members were indeed honest working men seeking social fellowship, others were full-time criminals who used the club's privacy to discuss business that could not be conducted over traced telephone lines. The FBI had attempted to plant listening devices in the club on multiple occasions, but the members' natural paranoia and the building's solid construction had frustrated these efforts. Mike's strategy for gaining acceptance at the club relied on patience and careful observation of social hierarchies. He would arrive in the early afternoon when the lunch crowd was thinning out, but before the serious evening business began. He would order a coffee and a sandwich, then settle at a corner table with a newspaper, projecting an image of someone with time to kill but no particular agenda. The key was demonstrating respect for the unspoken rules that governed behavior in such places. Mike never attempted to join conversations uninvited, never asked direct questions about anyone's business, and never displayed any particular curiosity about the club's operations. When other patrons spoke to him, he responded politely but briefly, establishing himself as someone who understood the value of keeping his mouth shut. Gradually, over weeks and months, this approach began to yield results. Other regulars started acknowledging his presence with nods or brief greetings. Someone might comment on a sports score or weather forecast, opening tiny windows of conversation that allowed Mike to demonstrate his knowledge of criminal culture without claiming any specific expertise or connections. The afternoons at the club provided Mike with invaluable intelligence about the family's structure and operations. He learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicated someone's position in the hierarchy, the way younger men deferred to their elders, the specific individuals who seemed to know everyone's business, the particular tables that were reserved for sensitive conversations. More importantly, he began to understand the psychology of organized criminals, their motivations and fears, and the complex code of honor that governed their relationships. Violence, Mike discovered, was both more and less prevalent than popular imagination suggested. While the threat of violence underlay every business relationship and personal interaction, actual bloodshed was relatively rare and usually reserved for specific circumstances: betrayal of family secrets, cooperation with law enforcement, or challenges to established authority. Most disputes were resolved through negotiation, economic pressure, or ritualized displays of dominance that allowed all parties to maintain their reputations while avoiding the complications that came with corpses. The evening hours brought different challenges and opportunities. Mike would typically leave the social club by 4 p.m., returning to his apartment to prepare for the night's activities. These might include attending social functions where family members would be present, conducting surveillance of suspected criminal operations, or meeting with his FBI handlers to report on the day's intelligence gathering. The handler meetings were perhaps the most psychologically demanding part of Mike's undercover assignment. After spending 12 to 14 hours immersed in criminal culture, he had to rapidly shift back to his law enforcement identity, providing detailed reports on conversations, relationships, and activities while maintaining the emotional distance necessary for effective intelligence analysis. The transformation was jarring, like stepping from one world into another, each with its own moral framework and behavioral expectations. These debriefing sessions typically took place in anonymous motel rooms or vacant offices, locations that could be reached without attracting the attention of anyone who might be watching Mike's movements. His handler, Special Agent Robert Chen, was a 15-year veteran of organized crime investigations who understood the unique stresses of long-term undercover work. Chen's job was not only to collect intelligence, but to monitor Mike's psychological state, watching for signs of the role contamination that could occur when agents spent too much time inhabiting criminal personas. The danger was real and constant. By 1978, organized crime families had become increasingly sophisticated in their counterintelligence efforts, employing techniques borrowed from espionage agencies to identify potential informants and undercover operatives. Known associates might be subjected to surprise interrogations about their backgrounds, their sources of income, or their knowledge of criminal techniques. Someone claiming to be a professional burglar might be challenged to demonstrate his lockpicking skills or his knowledge of alarm systems. Mike had spent weeks in training, mastering the technical skills that would support his cover identity. He could pick most standard residential locks, disable common alarm systems, and fence stolen merchandise through established channels. More importantly, he had learned to think like a criminal, approaching problems from the perspective of someone whose primary concerns were profit and avoiding arrest. The psychological pressure was immense. Mike was living a lie 24 hours a day, surrounded by people who would not hesitate to kill him if they discovered his true identity. Every conversation was a potential trap, every relationship a source of both valuable intelligence and mortal danger. The stress manifested in physical symptoms: chronic insomnia, digestive problems, and a persistent low-level anxiety that required constant mental discipline to control. Yet there were moments of genuine human connection that complicated the moral landscape of the investigation. Some of the criminals Mike encountered were undoubtedly dangerous men who had committed serious crimes, but others were products of limited opportunities and family traditions that valued loyalty above law. Jimmy Torino, the numbers runner, was supporting a disabled wife and 3 grandchildren on his illegal earnings. Sal Benedetto, the truck driver, had turned to crime after being blacklisted from legitimate employment following a union organizing attempt. These personal relationships added an ethical dimension to the investigation that FBI training had not fully prepared Mike to handle. While he never lost sight of his mission or his obligation to uphold the law, he found himself genuinely caring about some of the people he was investigating. When Jimmy's wife was hospitalized for emergency surgery, Mike felt authentic concern for the older man's financial struggles. When Sal's son was arrested on drug charges, Mike's sympathy for a father's anguish was entirely genuine. The complexity of these emotions was compounded by the knowledge that his investigation would eventually result in the arrest and imprisonment of people he had come to know as individuals, rather than simply criminal targets. The abstract concept of justice took on a more personal dimension when applied to specific human beings, with families, fears, and aspirations beyond their criminal activities. As autumn arrived and the investigation entered its 9th month, Mike began to see the fruits of his patient work. He had established relationships with more than a dozen members and associates of the Civella organization, gained access to several important locations, and gathered intelligence that was helping the FBI understand the family's structure and operations in unprecedented detail. The wiretaps at the Villa Capri and the Marlowe house were providing almost daily revelations about the organization's involvement in everything, from illegal gambling to labor racketeering. The breakthrough came in October, when Mike was finally invited to attend a private dinner at the Villa Capri to celebrate the birthday of Carl Civella, Nick's younger brother and second-in-command of the organization. The invitation came through Jimmy Torino, who had grown to trust the quiet burglar from Detroit and wanted to introduce him to higher-ranking family members who might have use for his specialized skills. The dinner was a revelation of the culture and customs that governed organized crime relationships. 23 men gathered in the restaurant's private dining room, ranging from young soldiers in their 20s to elderly veterans who had been involved in criminal activities since the Prohibition era. The seating arrangements reflected the organization's hierarchy, with the Civella brothers occupying positions of honor at the head of the table and lower-ranking members arrayed according to their status and relationships. The conversation flowed between legitimate topics: sports, local politics, family news, and more sensitive subjects that revealed the scope of the organization's criminal enterprises. Mike learned about the family's involvement in skimming operations at Las Vegas casinos, their control of illegal gambling throughout the Kansas City metropolitan area, and their connections to organized crime families in Chicago, Milwaukee, and other major cities. More importantly, he witnessed the complex web of personal relationships that held the organization together. Family bonds, ethnic loyalty, shared criminal history, and mutual financial interest created a social structure that was both remarkably durable and surprisingly fragile. The same personal connections that enabled the organization to operate effectively also created vulnerabilities that law enforcement could exploit. Carl Civella, Mike observed, was a very different personality from his older brother. Where Nick was charismatic and diplomatic, Carlo was more direct and aggressive in his approach to leadership. The brothers clearly respected each other and functioned as an effective team, but their different styles sometimes created tension within the organization. Some associates preferred Nick's more measured approach to business, while others responded better to Carl's willingness to use intimidation and violence to resolve disputes. The dinner also revealed the extent to which organized crime had adapted to changing social and economic conditions. The Kansas City family of 1978 was far more sophisticated than the crude gang of bootleggers and gamblers that had emerged during Prohibition. They employed accountants, lawyers, and legitimate business executives to manage their increasingly complex financial operations. They invested criminal profits in legal enterprises ranging from restaurants to construction companies, creating multiple layers of separation between the source of their wealth and its ultimate disposition. Yet traditional values and customs remained important. The dinner began and ended with toasts to family honor and mutual loyalty. Older members told stories about past generations of criminals, emphasizing themes of courage, honor, and respect for hierarchy. Younger men listened respectfully, absorbing lessons about the proper conduct of criminal business and the importance of maintaining the organization's reputation. As winter approached, Mike's position within the organization continued to evolve. He had proven his value as a source of information about security systems and potential targets for burglary operations, leading to invitations to participate in preliminary planning for several criminal enterprises. Each of these invitations represented both an opportunity to gather crucial intelligence and a test of his commitment to the criminal lifestyle. The FBI had established strict guidelines governing the extent to which undercover agents could participate in criminal activities. Mike was permitted to provide information and advice that might facilitate crimes, but he could not actively participate in violence or take actions that would directly result in harm to innocent victims. These limitations required careful navigation, as refusing to participate in certain activities might arouse suspicion about his commitment to the organization. The solution, in most cases, was to establish a reputation for specialized expertise that naturally limited the range of activities in which Mike would be expected to participate. As a supposed master burglar, he could legitimately claim that his skills were too valuable to risk on violent confrontations or activities that might result in lengthy prison sentences. This positioning allowed him to remain on the periphery of the organization's most serious crimes while maintaining his credibility as a committed criminal. The approach worked well until November, when Mike was invited to participate in what the organization euphemistically called a collection action, a violent assault on a businessman who had fallen behind on payments to illegal lenders. The invitation came from Vincent Torino, a mid-level family member who had been impressed by Mike's supposed expertise and wanted to test his willingness to engage in violence on the organization's behalf. The situation required careful handling. Refusing outright would certainly arouse suspicion and might result in Mike's expulsion from the organization or worse. Accepting would require him to participate in a serious felony that could result in severe injury to an innocent victim. After consulting with his handlers, Mike developed a strategy that allowed him to maintain his cover while preventing the planned assault from taking place. Mike agreed to participate in the collection action, but suggested that the timing was poor due to increased police patrols in the target area. He provided detailed information about the victim's schedule and security arrangements, information that the FBI used to ensure that the businessman was never in a vulnerable position. When the planned assault was repeatedly postponed due to unfavorable circumstances, Mike gradually shifted the focus toward less violent alternatives that might achieve the same financial objectives. The incident illustrated the moral complexity of long-term undercover operations. Mike had prevented a serious crime from taking place and gathered valuable intelligence about the organization's willingness to use violence. But he had also necessarily deceived people who trusted him and participated in planning activities that violated his oath as a law enforcement officer. The psychological toll of maintaining such deceptions was becoming increasingly difficult to bear. As 1978 drew to a close, Mike reflected on the year he had spent living among Kansas City's organized criminals. He had learned that the reality of organized crime was far more complex and human than popular culture suggested. These were not cartoon villains, but real people caught in a web of family loyalty, economic necessity, and cultural tradition that made criminal behavior seem like a rational career choice. Yet he had also seen the genuine harm that organized crime inflicted on communities and individuals. The illegal gambling operations preyed on working-class families who could ill afford to lose money on long-shot bets. The loan sharking activities trapped desperate borrowers in cycles of debt that could lead to violence and financial ruin. The corruption of public officials undermined democratic institutions and created a climate where laws were selectively enforced based on political connections rather than principles of justice. The investigation was entering its final phase. The intelligence gathered through Mike's efforts, combined with evidence from wiretaps and other surveillance techniques, was providing federal prosecutors with the foundation for a comprehensive case against the entire Civella organization. Within months, the carefully constructed world that Mike had inhabited would come crashing down in a series of arrests and trials that would effectively end organized crime's dominance in Kansas City. But for now, on this cold December evening, Mike sat in his modest apartment, reviewing the day's events and preparing for another night of deception. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, new tests of his ability to maintain his false identity, while gathering the intelligence that would ultimately bring justice to a community that had lived too long under the shadow of organized crime. The alarm clock was set for 5:30 a.m., just as it had been for the past 10 months. In a few hours, Tony Mercurio would emerge from this cramped apartment, ready to play his role in the shadow theater of criminal investigation. But tonight, in the privacy of his own thoughts, Special Agent Michael Torino allowed himself to remember who he really was and why his dangerous work mattered. The streets of Kansas City stretched out below his window, carrying the ordinary dreams and struggles of working families who deserved better than a community controlled by organized crime. For them, and for the principle of justice under law, Mike would continue his deception until the mission was complete. The cost was high, measured in stress, isolation, and moral complexity that would haunt him long after the investigation ended. But the cause was just, and the work was necessary. In the distance, the lights of the Villa Capri flickered in the winter darkness, marking another late-night gathering where criminal business was conducted with the quiet efficiency of a well-run corporation. Soon, very soon, those lights would be extinguished forever as the forces of law and order finally caught up with Nick Savella and his organization. The patient work of investigation and infiltration would yield its harvest of arrests and convictions, bringing to an end an era of organized crime that had flourished in Kansas City for more than 4 decades. But that reckoning lay in the future. Tonight, there was only the quiet apartment, the ticking clock, and the knowledge that tomorrow would bring another day of living a lie in service of a greater truth. In the shadow world, where federal agents and organized criminals played their deadly games, Special Agent Michael Torino prepared for another day of being someone else entirely, carrying the burden of justice into the heart of America's criminal underworld.